Hello, St. Peter's Parish. Father Osborne here again with another installment of Theology on Tape, a video series answering some follow-up questions from our most recent Theology on Tap at St. Peter's. First of all, before I forget, like I did in the last video, I want to invite you to our next Theology on Tap, which will take place on March 3rd. We'll announce the topic and more details as the date draws closer, but I wanted to get it on your radar. Also, I want to apologize for the video quality of the last video, specifically the fact that I cut my chin off from the video. So for all of you conspiracy theorists out there who are speculating, throwing out rumors that I cut off the tip of my beard and wanted to conceal it with the video, that's not the case. Okay, so last time we talked about some preliminary considerations we need to make if we are going to hear God's voice. Today, I want to speak specifically about how we can hear God's voice personally spoken to us through his scriptures. One point to note at the outset is scripture is a very different kind of literature than all other human literatures. Other human literatures are read passively by the reader, and they're not meant to connect us directly with the author. But in Scripture, because it's the living word, meaning it is God's voice speaking to us through the written word of the human author, then we can actually interact, and we do come in contact with the author himself, with the principal author, who is God. So because that's the case, then we can interact with Scripture in the way that we would with another friend, in the way that we would have conversation with another friend. We can ask questions, we can probe the text further and expect an answer to come back to us. So I think just a few examples of ways that Scripture has spoken to me in my own life. One right at the outset that I can think of is whenever a line hits me in a particular way. There may be times whenever I've read a gospel passage over and over again, or particularly with the Psalms. I'll have read a psalm many times because of praying the Liturgy of the Hours, and then one day there's a particular verse that just makes total sense to me in the context of my life. And maybe it's because I needed to experience something beforehand in order to really understand the depths of what God was trying to say to me through that scripture passage. But I find in that moment that I'm more willing and ready to accept the line of scripture at face value as the truth. Another example is whenever reading, in particular, the Gospels, and a story of perhaps one of Jesus's miracles comes along, and I'm struck or my attention is grabbed by an example in the story, or perhaps a character's motivation, or someone's response resonates with me or draws me to consider that further. And then I begin to maybe just chew on that passage and maybe interrogate the situation a little bit, ask, why this moved me in this way, what compelled me, comparing those things to perhaps what's going on in my own life at the time. And I wanted to share an example with you specifically of an instance of this happening whenever I was praying with the blind man who was healed in Matthew's gospel. So there's this blind man that has been blind for a number of years, and he begs the Lord to restore his sight. And whenever Jesus does this, the first thing that this man does is he chooses to follow Jesus. Instead of going to live the life that he had never had before, his instinct is to follow after the Lord, to drop everything and to follow him. And as I was praying with this scripture passage, I began to ask God to make clear why this caught my attention. The fact that his first choice after regaining his sight was to follow Jesus. And then after I asked that question, I noticed that the blind man didn't skip a beat. He was immediately followed the Lord. And I thought, why did he choose that? I imagined that the new life he gained by receiving his sight, maybe it overwhelmed him, and he wondered what more Jesus had to offer him. And then I began to think, well, maybe he was overwhelmed in gratitude, that he wanted to try to repay Jesus by becoming his disciple. And as those thoughts were going on in my head, at the same time, I noticed kind of rising to the surface of my consciousness some memories of the past few days where I had felt like I didn't really know where God's presence was in certain situations. And I was reminded to ask Jesus in that moment to be able to see his will more clearly in those places. So something that was happening to the blind man in the gospel in some ways was relating to my own experience in life, and the Lord was making those two come together for me to realize a deeper truth, which ultimately, as I came to the end of that prayer, I realized what resulted was this desire to keep my gaze fixed on Jesus in the course of my day, that to follow him in the minute choices that I make, not make my own plans of how to live my priesthood out, but to trust that if I make every effort to follow him, that he will show me his will in matters whenever he wants to. So a couple of other ways that we can hear God's voice is sometimes God speaks directly into a situation of our life using the words of Scripture. I think this oftentimes is described by people whenever they say, man, I needed to hear that gospel passage. Like that spoke directly to X, Y, or Z situation in my life. And oftentimes that is how the Lord speaks to us using Scripture, is he will use a particular passage of Scripture to speak directly into a time-sensitive situation in our lives. And then lastly, I think it's important to note that oftentimes whenever we're having this conversation in prayer, the voice, like in my example of the questions that I was asking and the insight that I was getting, the voice often sounds like my own voice. But that's because the Lord can use my imagination to speak to me. And yeah, it's going to sound like my voice, but that doesn't mean that it's just me thinking thoughts, because oftentimes they're things that I never would have come up with on my own. So these are just a few ways in which we can each hear the voice of God through his Holy Scripture. In our next video, we'll focus more on how God uses the movements of our heart to speak to us and what that can look like. Remain blessed, St. Peter's.